And our next speaker is Abubakar Aziz from Northeastern University, who will be presenting the paper Johnny Still Can't Opt Out, Assessing the IAB CCPA Compliance Framework.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Aziz, and I'm a PhD student from Northeastern University. And I'm going to talk about my work, Johnny Still Can't Opt Out, Assessing the IAB CCPA Compliance Framework. And this work will be slightly different from the previous two talks. It's about more about applied privacy. So a little bit background about technical standard. So CCPA is a California privacy law which was introduced in 2020, and one of its aim was to protect privacy or user data of the California resident by allowing them to have the option of opt out of data selling or data sharing. So it requires that publishers to which this law applies should have explicit notice that allows the users to opt out of data sharing or selling. And in response to CCPA, IAB US, which is a business organization that tries to develop some technical standards for online advertisement and consent flow, introduced this CCPA framework, which is a technical standard and which is meant to standardize how consent will transfer from publishers to third parties and among the third parties. So in this next slide, I'm going to briefly talk about what IAB CCPA framework looks like. So let's say a user visits a website, which is like say CNN.com, and clicks on Do Not Sell link. And this, after clicking on Do Not Sell link, IAB says that this consent choice should be made available on the publisher website through this USB API function. This USB API function should return USB string or US privacy string, which encodes users' consent choices. That is basically like a 4-character string, and for the purpose of our paper, we are only concerned with the third character in the string. The N value means that user has opted in for data selling or sharing. Y means that user has opted out of data selling or sharing. And IAB says that this consent string should be stored in a US privacy cookie. They also says that third parties present on our web page JavaScript can call this API and retrieve the consent string. And third parties can also pass this consent string to other third parties via HTTP request URL parameters, such that they can pass it to other advertisers so they know what are the consent choices of the users are. And there's some recent work that has looked into different parts of the CCPA and CCPA framework, and most of this work is being presented in this conference. So Zimic et al. Developed better GPC opt-out user interfaces. GPC is a global privacy control. Basically, it's a browser-based signal that allows users to opt out of data selling or sharing. And I hope you guys attended Zimic's talk, so he has described in detail how GPC works. And there's Zimic et al. And Cherrett et al. Also found that some publishers are adopting the CCPA framework and react to the GPC signal. There was a talk yesterday by Leo et al. That showed that users' data continue to be sold even after they have opted out. But no one looked into in depth how the consent flows happens from the first parties to the third parties and among the third parties. In other words, we investigate whether the CCPA framework is able to faithfully communicate users' consent choices from publishers to third parties. I also want to mention that our work is somewhat similar to Methi et al. That looked into IAB Europe TCF framework in 2020 and found many violations of cookie banners with respect to TCF. So we have 4 main research questions. So question number 1 is like, how well this CCPA framework is adopted by top publishers? To what extent this USB string is being passed from publishers to third parties? To what extent is the USB string being passed among the third parties? And are users' decisions to opt out being passed to the third parties or not? So I've discussed briefly the background. Now I'm going to go over real quick about some important methodological details. So we designed a custom crawler, and our custom crawler visits top 10,000 websites from Tranquil lists. And on every web page, our crawler makes a call to USB API and extract the USB string. We also grab all the cookies present on a web page. And our crawler also logs which third parties is reading and writing the USB API. We also grab all the HTTP requests and responses. And in addition to HTTP requests and responses, we also want to know which third party is sending a request to which other third parties. So for that reason, we also grab inclusion chains that tells us exactly which third party sends a request to other third party that includes the USB string or consent parameter. Again, more details of this inclusion chains are mentioned in the paper, how it works, and there has been lots of prior work that has used this tool, so feel free to read it. In short, we run 4 different crawls with slightly different configuration. And in 2 of the crawls, our crawler just visited the websites as it is without any modification to the crawler. We named these no opt-out crawls. The purpose of these 2 crawls was just to investigate the use of the USB API in the normal circumstances and how many websites have adopted the framework and what default constant string is being passed around. But we also want to know what happens when the user has opted out, whether CCPA framework is able to faithfully communicate users' consent choices or not. For that reason, we run 2 additional crawls with opt-out configuration. In one of the crawls, we injected the USB API into every website that returns opt-out USB string. That signifies that user has opted out. And in other crawl, we send opt-out signal through GPC signal that sends signals to the website the user has opted out of data selling or sharing. So now I'm going to talk about the most important results. So first is like how well the CCPA framework is adopted. We find that very low number of publishers have adopted the CCPA framework. Around only 8.2% of the top publishers have adopted. And this is concerning because if top publishers are not adopting this consent framework, then third parties that are relying on this framework to get consent won't be able to get user consent choices. Our findings are also similar to some recent prior work, which found that only 8.3% of the websites have adopted this USB API framework. And next question is like how consistently third parties read and pass USB string. And I'm going to demonstrate this with another example. What does it exactly means? Let's say a user visited a publisher website, CNN.com, and that loads a JavaScript from Tag Manager. And on this CNN.com, the Tag Manager calls a USB API to get USB string, which is good. But on another website, let's say user visited New York Times, the Tag Manager is present, is loaded, but it doesn't call this USB API function to get USB string. So first, we want to measure how consistently third-party JavaScripts read this USB API. And next, we want to measure whenever the 2 third parties communicate with each other with HTTP. When someone sends an HTTP request to other third party, does it include this consent parameter or not? For example, in this example, Google Tag Manager sends a request to Magnite and includes a USB string. But in other case, it may send a request to Magnite but may not include the USB string. So we want to measure the consistency of how they send the USB string to each other. And yeah, so I'm going to show you 2 CDF plot on this thing. On the left-hand side, the x-axis shows how consistently a particular third-party JavaScript read a USB API, and y-axis shows percentage of those third-party JavaScript. And in this plot, we only consider those third-party JavaScript that at least make a single request to a USB API on at least one publisher. In other words, we found sadly that 90% of the third-party JavaScript never reads USB API. And out of those that are reading a USB API function, we find that only about 50% of the third-party JavaScript read the USB API consistently, and 50% of the third-party JavaScript reads the USB API in inconsistent manner. Similarly, on the right-hand side, x-axis shows how consistently HTTP request pairs in our chains whenever their pair contain USB string, and y-axis shows percentage of the third-party pairs. And even in this case, we found that 90% of the pairs never share USB string. And of those who are communicating, we found that roughly about 50% of the pairs communicate the USB string consistently whenever they communicate, and 50% communicate inconsistently. And these findings demonstrate even if the framework is adopted by the publishers, third parties are calling this API inconsistently or passing this consent string to other third parties in an inconsistent manner. So the last question is like, we want to investigate the reach of opt-out signals to the third parties, which means like how many HTTP requests are made to the third parties, and how many HTTP requests to the third parties include a USB string set to opt-out. So I'm going to give first a small example. So on x-axis, there's a particular third party, let's say 3Lift, and y-axis shows percentage of the HTTP requests that are made to the third parties that include opt-out signal. And in the normal circumstances, in the normal two crawls, when we send no opt-out signal, we find very low propagation of the opt-out signals in the HTTP request. It makes sense because right now, user has not opted out. And in the crawl where we send our GPC signal on every website, we still find very low propagations of the opt-out signal to the downstream parties. This is concerning because if opt-out signals are not sent, if opt-out signals is not being communicated with the HTTP request to the third parties, they may not be aware of the consent choices of the users. And lastly, where we injected the USB API on every web page that returns USB string to opt-out, we do see more propagations of the opt-out signals, but the overall percentage is still very low. Roughly around like 25% of the HTTP request contains opt-out signals. And if we see the bigger picture of the top 30 third parties, which are mostly advertisement analytics, we find that GPC did not have much of an impact. Like if you send a GPC signal, the downstream parties to HTTP request do not contain opt-out signals. With opt-out USB string API, which returns, like our implementation returns the opt-out USB string, we do find more greater coverage of the and reach of the opt-out signals in the HTTP request, but the overall percentage is still very, very low. Like only six third parties had 20 or 25% of the opt-outs in the HTTP request. To summarize, is CCPA framework able to faithfully convey user consent choices? We believe no. We believe primarily because first it's adopted by the very low number of publishers. Even if it's adopted by the very low number of publishers, the third parties are calling the API inconsistently and passing this consent string inconsistently to other third parties. And overall, opt-out signal reach to the third parties is pretty low. And the main 2-3 takeaways key takeaways are that the industry standards for consent transmission are failing. And we believe, like there was a talk 2 days ago about Sebastian, which said we also support that the browser-based consent signals with regulatory support such as GPC are more likely to succeed. And GPC should be respected not by the publishers, but the third parties as well, without any intermediaries. And yeah, so feel free to read our paper more in details. There are more details about our mechanism. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aziz, for the great talk.
Yeah, thanks.
And now we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, that was a fantastic talk. Great work, really. I wonder, what do you think should be done here? Do you want to contact the IAB or should they improve their system somehow? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my key takeaway is I think in my humble opinion, consent flow is very simple. If the user has opted out from GPC signal, we first don't need these intermediaries. Like we have CMPs and we already know doc patterns. So first, with GPC signal should be respected by the third parties. IAB could improve, but unless there is a support from the regulatory, this standard should be adopted and respected. I feel I'm not pretty hopeful. And they're introducing a new framework by Global Privacy Control, which is more complex. So yeah, unless there's, I feel some regulatory push to adopt these standards, it's a little bit from my side, technical details are so complex that consent flow will happen smoothly. Yeah.
So I want to ask your opinion about, again, I agree with all of what you said, but way I think this is currently set up is publishers seem to be responsible for making sure that they pass along this consent string. So using a couple of examples, let's say you showed Google Tag Manager. If Google Tag Manager, let's say, sends a request to some other advertiser and does not pass along the consent string, who do you think is responsible for that? Is it the publisher who configured Google Tag Manager, or there should be better support in Google Tag Manager for that?
Look, that's a very good question. I think my critique is not to anyone particular, trying to fix a responsibility on the publisher. I feel ultimately publisher is responsible from the user's perspective because user is sending consent string to the publisher. But I also feel the way the system is designed, it's not only just publisher that should be responsible for the content propagation. If they're like Google Tag Manager that are using, that are responsible to passing content to other third parties, they should also be a little bit more responsible. But I am just criticizing in this paper the overall like IAB system. It's not like fixing the responsibility, like publisher is responsible for the third parties. So in my opinion, like if the third parties receive the consent signal, they should also act upon. It should not be just the responsibility of the publisher.
Okay,
Can you agree?
thank you so much. Let's thank Aziz again for his awesome talk.
Thank you.